Okay. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Let me go into something. There it is. Let me just go into the slides. Okay, so this presentation is a broad overview of the research that I undertook over a period of, it was about 7+ years, and which formed the body of my PhD thesis, Darkness Visible, Contemporary Stop Motion Animation and the Uncanny. I apologize in advance to anyone who's read through either the introduction or the conclusion, because the contents of this presentation will sound vaguely familiar if you've done that. So I start my thesis with a couple of quotes. The first one is from Paul Demand's The Resistance to Theory, and the second is from an article about Charlie Kaufman. And it discusses the apparent resurgence of stop motion in the 2010s. And these two quotes very much tell the reader where I'm going to be taking them. My thesis is a study of the relationship between that phenomenon we've come to know as the uncanny, the form of film animation commonly referred to as stop motion, and what I would call the unsettling dark space that they seem to occupy. In both of them, I argue, there is a collapse of borders, a blurring between what appear to be opposites, and a series of disturbing visions of fears long repressed and hidden away becoming manifest. It's that sense of the familiar made unfamiliar, and Paul Demand talks about it in his essay, very much sounding like Sigmund Freud. He says that the unhomely, or what Freud would call das Unheimliche in his native German, or uncanny when it's translated into English, is in some way a species of the familiar, or das Heimliche, the homely, particularly where it's concerned with the notion of the hidden and the dangerous and how it's come into the open. In his essay on the uncanny, Freud describes the fear and dread that are symptomatic of the uncanny experience, and he marks it out from other categories in what he calls the field of the frightening, by explaining that it goes back to what was once known and had long been familiar. So these two people are talking in very similar terms. Freud later adds, importantly for me, that the acme of the uncanny is represented by anything to do with death, a subject that he returns to again and again in his work. I'll address this again later. My thesis looks in much greater depth at the forms taken by the uncanny, and specifically as they identified by Freud. And my reason for focusing on Freud is that his essay is basically the template for a lot of the academic work on the uncanny that came after it. Some of the categories of the uncanny that Freud identifies I've listed here, and I would argue that stop motion animation is ideally suited to present them visually. It resembles the uncanny in many respects as an art form that defies boundaries and resists definition. Its subjects appear to be imbued with a spark of the kinetic and a semblance of life, but I would argue that at the same time, stop motion embodies inertia, lifelessness, and death. These dual properties are there in the name, stop and motion, and they quickly become apparent when you watch closely any stop motion sequence. And here's one from Jan Spankmayer's film Alice, where he blends animation with live action, probably the best way to see what I'm talking about. Stop motion traditionally involves the intricate, incremental manipulation of three-dimensional models, objects such as stones, toys, bones here, and even people. The isolated positions in which the subject is photographed during what are often extremely slow filming processes come together and form something akin to actual movement in the final edit. The result is an eerie impression of life, which imitates, whilst not quite duplicating, true dynamism. And this is an important distinction. The appearance of life, as presented in the stop motion sequence, often feels stylized and otherworldly, a wondrous and yet slightly off-kilter simulation born out of inertia. As viewers, we are perhaps conscious of the constant presence of the stop, which we catch momentarily behind the motion, and this is most likely an effect of art versus biology. The simple fact is that as sentient beings, we rarely think through each increment of our movement. Instead, the work of putting one foot in front of the other is internalized and taken for granted. The deconstructing process, whereby stop motion animation is created, by contrast, imbues its subjects with a deliberateness that is unnatural. And as a result, we are left viewing something that seems to be alive, but at the same time, we question its sentience in the back of our mind. It's familiar, yet unfamiliar in the same moment. And this creates a sense of the uncanny in stop motion, which, I argue, has in turn informed the way that stop motion animators approach the themes and narratives of their films. Some scholars have written about this affinity between stop motion and the uncanny. A few of them are listed here, but they don't pursue the idea at any great length. And it's this gap that led me to explore the area in my thesis. The bulk of my research is built around case studies of several contemporary stop motion animators, Shinya Tsukamoto, Jan Svankmajer, and the Key brothers. These directors were specifically chosen because of their consistent engagement with the darker side of stop motion. All three have produced stop motion work that makes little or no attempt to contain those elements, which are most closely associated with the uncanny, and associated manifestations of what Freud has referred to as the death drive, the pull towards the dark that he suggests is part of the human condition. So Tsukamoto, I've got a clip of Tetsuo here. He draws on the context of modern Tokyo's technological advancement to create his metallization effects. Fragments of machines and other items of detritus animated and made to appear as if they are taking over the bodies of his protagonists. The images suggest signs of illness manifesting itself, which we can relate to what Freud terms the influence of demons appearing from inside us, as well as fears that the body is losing its integrity, associated in the uncanny with castration and a proximity to death. The physical properties of object and clay animation and the incremental nature of stop motion, with its deliberateness of movement, accentuate the fear of biological trauma and loss of identity. There is an unsettling impression of doubling as the body becomes simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar, which is taken to extremes in Tetsuo as characters who uncannily mirror each other's appropriation of metal become conjoined, as in this clip. Images suggesting birth are repeatedly seen to merge with those connoting death in the Tetsuo films. The ambiguity of stop motion, where life and lifelessness is expressed simultaneously, is epitomized by what Tsukamoto describes as a new world order, where people are consumed by and born out of artificial wombs of metal and plastic. The animated rhizome, root, or tentacle that the director intercuts throughout the two films likewise connotes both forward motion associated with independence and individual advancement, while at the same time it suggests umbilical attachment and the return to an interdependent intrauterine state. The frenzy of the tentacle suggests it is nourished by decay and is an expression of the primal within, much like the uncanny. Pardon me, I'll just have some water. I examined different aspects of Jan Svankmajer's stop motion work with an eye to the black humor that he brings to it. Here's a clip from The Flat. Bearing in mind his desire to maintain a connection with childhood and the way children see the world, I explore how the home is made uncanny by the presence of playfully sinister animated objects that make strange the familiar setting of the home. It's a reflection of Svankmajer's own experience working as a filmmaker in Czechoslovakia under an oppressive communist regime. Animation makes physical the sense that anything could be alive and threaten in Svankmajer's films, and that even the home is not a safe refuge. But he does it with comedy, a little bit of black comedy. Images such as a coffin interring itself in a tomb in The Fall of the House of Usher demonstrate Svankmajer's fondness for what could be termed gallows humour. The stop motion animations that can be read as blackly comic in his work remain uncanny because they are so dark and macabre. Rather than something which simply engenders mirth, Svankmajer's humour is accompanied by a grim irony. His stop motion images frequently engage with the same vein of humour as some of Georges Méliès's trick animations, films such as The 400 Tricks of the Devil or in The Monster, where a woman is thrown to her husband and arrives in his arms as a skeleton. Freedom is a key theme of Svankmajer's work, but it is often problematic as it brings with it the collapsing of boundaries and of structure. For instance, Svankmajer often depicts parts of the body as liberated from the whole, moving independently or exaggeratedly, or, as in here, in Darkness, Light, Darkness, they reconstitute themselves into freakish forms. Sometimes he substitutes body parts or elides their purpose, and the effect is frequently disturbing and always uncanny. The Key brothers habitually use stop motion to depict themes of solitude and darkness, and these are two manifestations of the uncanny in Freud's essay that are often overlooked. Their stop motion objects and characters are very often shown compulsively repeating themselves, an uncanny form of return that seems to connote a convergence between futile eroticism, especially in this clip from Street of Crocodiles, and death. It suggests that the Keys are seeking to make manifest the notion of the death drive. This is a Freudian concept that is addressed directly elsewhere in his work, and which haunts his essay on the uncanny like an unspoken presence lurking between the lines. There are stop motion images throughout the Keys' work in which characters wander alone as if lost, sometimes appearing to be in a dream or a trance. It's a method by which the Key brothers express the solitude of their characters, which is also articulated through uncanny signs of madness or insanity, in which psychosis isolates the patient. Their mania is frequently expressed through stop motion expressions of repetition, and there are reiterated images of objects manically spinning and juddering as if they're being controlled by someone, which we can relate to what Freud terms the omnipotence of thoughts. The Key brothers have expressed their desire to make a world that is seen through a dirty pane of glass, and this is illustrated by the uncanny animations of body parts and detritus that interact in films such as Street of Crocodiles. Objects and figures are frequently deconstructed or discarded, left to lie in dust, dirt, and blood, such as the central character in Masca, which is here. An insect-like creature is hidden inside an apparently human body. My thesis doesn't leave out those stop-motion animators who might be considered more mainstream. I do address their work in a separate chapter, and I argue that the darker registers of stop-motion are largely sublimated, but are still detectable in the films. I'm thinking particularly of Nick Park and Aardman, represented here by Wallace and Gromit, Tim Burton, such as The Nightmare Before Christmas, and Henry Selick. I think they work together on The Nightmare Before Christmas. And then you've got Henry Selick's Coraline. I argue that narrative strategies such as the use of humor and a knowingness about cinema reduce the uncanny effects in their animation without eliminating them. Well, I hope this has given you at least a flavor of my research into stop motion and the uncanny, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Derrin. That was really interesting and inspiring for me. I just leave my thoughts to the end of the session and ask Vincenzo.
Yes, sorry, I had problem with the connections with the internet. I'm here. I know that was the wrong moment to do that. Okay. So can I share my desktop, right?
Sure.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
That's fine.
Okay. I'm Vincenzo Maselli. I'm a research fellow in design, in product design in Rome, in Sapienza University, and today, actually, first of all, I want to thank for inviting me for this event that I think is very interesting and important for sharing the outcome and the idea of the research. And this research, the research that I will explain today, I will try to summarize like in 3 years of research. I will be quick, I promise. And as I told you before, I come from a department of product design. And the main challenge of my research was to bring together 3 different I speak about an interdisciplinary study because most of the analysis that I conducted on puppets is a material analysis. Thompson Smith. Start with the presentation. I hope you are seeing this. This is a kind of map that I built to explain the entire path of the research. I will be quick in some points, so I will skip some of them. Otherwise, I won't be able to stay in 20 minutes, 15 minutes. So, starting point of my research was the analysis of puppets as design object. This analysis was both a material analysis, but also a typological analysis. In particular, I took into account what the Victorian Essen describes in his book, The Secret Life of Puppets, just to understand how many typology of puppets does exist in an anthropological perspective. And of course, at the end of this analysis, I in particular analyzed animated puppets. What kind of analysis on animated puppet I conducted? First of all, I very quickly try to summarize the evolution of stop-motion animation, but not just the technique, but the material and the fabrication processes applied for fabricate puppets. By conducting this analysis, I took into account, of course, a few references coming from the Susan Shaw, Ken Priby, an Italian researcher, Stefano Bessoni, Bruce Holman, Peter Lord, just to understand what kind of classification of puppets have been made so far. And in all of them, I found this kind of classification that you already know, I think. So object animation, play animation, and puppet animation that are more referred to the kind of object used in the film. So I asked myself, okay, but how can I try to solve the problem with the classification that took into account sometimes the animation technique, sometimes the material, otherwise the fabrication process. So I first of all decided to focus on a specific material aspect of puppets, that is their material, their skin. I formulated the idea of animated puppet skin material. And it was very important in this analysis to consider what the literature says about the concept of skin, not just in the realm of puppet and animation, but in a more general view in the film field of design. So I took into account a few references coming from design, like the Italian researcher but also practitioner Ezio Manzini, Giovanni Pallasma, that is an architect, Eleonora Fiorani, Barbara Del Curto, because actually I discovered that the research about material aspect of design object, the name is material-driven design, is mostly conducted is led by Italian researchers. On the other, this research was useful to analyze the skin with the idea of skin as physical boundary and protective barrier. So skin that covers, contains, and separates. On the other hand, I took into account references coming from the film studies who analyze the importance of touch. It is the skin of the viewer, the skin of the user, if we consider the design field. And in particular, I consider what Giovanni Pallasma says about the see through the skin, and the idea of touch through the eyes. And so the main references in this case were Laura Marks, the concept of active visuality, Jennifer Barker, the concept of tactile looking, and Vivian Sobczak with the idea of mutual relationship between body and film. And the last analysis conducted on the puppet material skin was a community, the idea of, in general, skin, the idea of skin as a communicative interface. This analysis was very important for the final outcome of the research, because it gave me the possibility to ask myself, what does material skin communicate? The two main aspects that I took into account in order to answer this question consider the indexical traces of actions conducted, so the material has been targeted to, and the situations in which material has been used. I applied all these references to the analysis of puppet skin material in order to formulate what I called the different dimensions of puppet skin. The first one is the material dimension of puppet skin, that was a very technical analysis that just made myself able to distinguish the cases in which bulk and skin are made with the same material, the one in which they are different, and the one in which the material is the same, but the chemical and physical from on the surface of the puppet from those in the bulk. Another dimension of analysis was the puppet sensory skin. And so the touching puppet, it was very inspiring analysis, because it made me analyze some references coming from the production of the last 40 years of puppet animation. Some of them have been mentioned by Derrin. And sorry. Okay, and the last dimension that I analyzed was the puppet's narrating skin. In order to formulate an idea of a narrating skin, first of all, I decided to formulate a new kind of classification. And to do that, in order to do that, I consider both anthropological references, and first of all, Victoria Nelson, that I already mentioned, because in the book, The Secret Life of Puppet, Victoria Nelson mentioned different typologies of families of puppets belonging to different field of different discipline, different field of knowledge. So from religion, alchemy, technology, theater, and also toy design. And another very important reference comes from the field of design, product design. The designer William Cromer, in his article Metaphors to Sculpture, identifies 4 main manufacturing processes applied to material. So both design, used both in design and art. And those categories are addiction, the additive work builds a malleable material up to a process of modeling, subtraction, the subtractive work that reveals the form hidden inside a large volume through a process of carving, assembly, the process that consists of the practices of manipulating of existing things through the use of found objects, assemblage and construction, and substitution, also called casting. So the process described as the process of creating a form in an original intermediate material in order to recreate that form in a second final matter. Those two references, so Victoria Nelson and William Cromer, were the basic references to formulate my new categorization. I call it design-driven categories, and those categories were 5. that will actually replicate in a way the categorization suggested by Derrin Crawte, but applied to different kind of objects, so puppets. And I will not explain each of them because more or less the criteria of classification are the same that I already explained. So we have modeled material skin puppets, assembled material skin puppet, carved material skin puppets, casted material skin puppet, and also I added another category to those suggested by Crawte, and I defined it layered materials, meaning a particular form of assemblage that consists of different layers of material that cover the bulk, as well as human skin. Is important probably because I realized just at the end of the thesis that those categories that could be, of course, reformulated also did not consider another typology of puppet skin. It is very a contemporary one, and so I suggest a possible future integration of these categories by adding the digitally altered puppet skin. So the case in which the digital work is a tool used to create hybrid images. Okay, this actually was one of the main outcome of the research, but I also wanted to challenge myself trying to provide a sort of interpretation linked to this formulated category. So I also had to consider references coming from other fields of studies, and I had to consider intangible aspects of material to provide a possible interpretation. So I considered the idea of puppets, material skin memories, and I divided the memories in three main typology, coming from the process of animation, construction, and so manipulation of the puppet. They call them gestural memories that are actually traces of manipulation, and that they depended on the relationship between the action of the puppeteer. The fabrication memories that I also call traces of fabrication that are left by the puppet maker, and material memories that were the most challenging one to define, because they are related to an anthropological dimension of memory and materials. And I found very interesting references in the field of material-driven design and in what the reconstruction, historical and anthropological reconstruction provided by Victoria Nelson. So at the end, I also, I will be very short about that because I needed some case studies to apply this new methodology of analysis. So I took into account 18 case studies that are those one. I will not read each of them, otherwise we won't be, I will take too time. I just want to explain you how I selected my case studies. The first criteria of selection was the subgenre they belong. So I just took into account self-reflexive and self-recognition narratives. So puppet that behaves, has a puppet maker as an animator, or at least self-conscious about its being an animate object. Puppet film in which we can find anthropomorphic puppets. I took into account a time range from 2009 to 2016, and the source of selection were several animation festivals recognized by the Academy Awards in the 2017, because the main research was made in 2017. how I collected informations through interviews, mostly information about the manufacturing processing and the materials. I was able to interview 13 directors or puppet makers out of 18, so I think is a good number. And of course also indirect sources, so desk research. Finally, the methodology of film analysis aim to investigate materials and fabrication processes using the making of the puppets, systematize each case studies according to the categories that I defined, so the design-driven categories. And I also build a very quick scheme about how I analyze them. I put them trying to cross the material skin puppets category and the hero production. And another, the final, the one that I was explaining, was the interpretation of symptomatic meaning through the combination of anthropological meanings of material associated with each category. So I took into account those that I defined material memories, anthropological meanings of manufacturing processes that identify the category, so the fabrication memories, and the relationship that was very important in order to formulate the real, those that I defined meta-narratives, the relationship between material and fabrication memories and diegetic level of each film. I will be, I will conclude by explaining which meta narratives I try to formulate. Of course, they are based on historical anthropological related to the two categories of modeled and assembled material skin puppets, I formulated the theme, the meta-narrative of the times of creation, that has a few sub-themes that I formulate in order to apply, to interpret each case study that I have. So the mythological time of creation, the biological time of gestation and growth, and the technological time of artificial creation. Those are the case studies in which I was able to find those meta-narratives. Related to the category of carved material skin puppets, I formulated the meta-narrative of the metaphor, control, and destruction as an act of freedom, and I found this theme in this meta-narrative in the two films, Ossa and Marilyn Miller. Then, related to the casted materials, I formulated another meta-narrative that is from the value of perfection to the research for imperfection. Also in this case, because I have several case studies who show this kind of puppets, I had to formulate sub-themes, like considering the relationship between reality and realism, the obsession for perfection and failure, and imperfection as a new aesthetic paradigm. These are the films in which I found these themes. And finally, to the layered material skin puppets, I associated to this category, I formulate the meta-narrative of the material dimension of nostalgia, vulnerability, absence, and emotional loss. And I analyze these themes according to the diegetic level of these two case studies, so Comaneco's Christmas and Marionette. So at the end, I will be very short. Okay, do I have time or no? Probably not. Anyway, I just want to provide which kind of perspective we can read the research with. So as a contribution to the field of material design, as a contribution to the field of stop motion animation film analysis, is an opening of a new path of research. Of course, there are improvements and future outlooks that could be taken, and that can concern the new criteria of selection, new parameters applied for the formulating of categories, the analysis of new case studies, and of course the variation of criteria of identifying meta-narratives. So I don't know if I probably took more that I had. I'm sorry in that case, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo. And I'm not sure whether Katherine is ready or not.
Right, okay, I'm ready. I'm good.
Then you can go on.
I am, yes, I am. Great, thank you. Okay. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about my central thesis of my PhD in the context of my practice, that is the film Potter's Mirror. I'm currently in my third year of a part-time PhD at the Mima School of Art and Design here at Teesside. And so I'm only about a third of the way through my actual PhD. And the film is work in progress at the moment, but it's intended to use a mixture of techniques to explore the uncanny within animation. I've only got a couple of slides today, but the images on the slides are from the concept artwork for the film that, as I say, is currently in production. So the film essentially is about a man who is forced to escape his own mind through a window. It's set in a single room that is symbolic of the conscious and unconscious spaces of the mind. I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of the film today. I just would rather focus on its use of animated taxidermy, which was sort of the impetus for starting my PhD. I'm interested in the uncanny and in relation to those sorts of objects, and I'm just going to sort of use that to explore my current thinking on my thesis. One second. Okay. So my central thesis is that animation exposes the internal wound, an almost existential crisis, if you will, that of mind, body, and sort of human as machine. The contradiction that is the colliding of intellectual, sort of internal rather duality, our experience of body as matter and body as phenomena, the rational versus the symbolic. That's sort of like the post-enlightenment anxiety that I may be no more than a sophisticated machine, similar to the anxieties revealed by epileptic seizures that both Freud and Jens talk about in their papers on the uncanny. That is, that the seizure reveals to the spectator an internal mechanical hidden process beneath the surface. This fear that we are no more than a set of causal or neurological events, no more than matter, and with no true agency. So for Segal, the perpetual absence is as the core of the human being is, in his words, the authentic experience of the human condition, an absence that is almost like a living death, that is a death that haunts us, not just the death to come, but the possibility that we are nothing more than machine, behind which there is sort of nothing more, this ontological crisis, if you will, that was felt in the sophisticated automaton of past centuries and in the modern robots of today that we see from the likes of Boston Dynamics and companies like that. The mechanical object and the animated cartoon are both able to purvey an effective emotional transference. After all, who does not cry when they watch Dumbo being cradled by his mother's trunk, or experience a sense of shock when seeing the man kicking the Boston Dynamic robot dog sort of ferociously and relentlessly in an attempt to make it fall over. These things bring us to question whether, like these objects, our sense of being is an illusion, the boundary between rational and mystical collapsing, this sort of the soul absent and the mechanical reigning. In addition to these ideas, I'm also interested in multiple time flows within a single image frame within a film, and what that reveals about our internal contradiction of the conscious experience of time and the unconscious nature of time. That is the sort of interweaving of past, present and future in an almost sort of Bergson idea of time that happens within the unconscious. After all, the unconscious is, for Freud, a timeless place, and in the words of Carol Leader, is a place where dimensional time and space vanish. And how that duality of internal and external experience of time brings a sense of the uncanny through a loss of agency within time itself, and this revealing of an internal alienation through a sort of heterotopic, heteroeconomic space of anxiety. But today, as I say, I'm going to focus on reanimated taxidermy. So the film Potter's Mirror explores all of these ideas through its mixtures of techniques. It uses stop motion 2D mixed with pixelation, a whole gambit of things. And one thing that is prominent in the film is the reanimation of taxidermy objects. And indeed, that was the impetus for the PhD, was to explore this idea. For me, these objects ask interesting questions about the punctum within animation and the question of agency and the human-machine anxiety. So the reanimation of death through the use of taxidermy objects as puppets, and what that suggests about the hiding place of the uncanny within animation is something I'm yet to fully explore. But here I just want to outline some of my sort of working hypothesis, if you like, and as it stands sort of at the moment. Now, in regard to live action film, Mulvey points to the uncanny rather being linked to the Barthian that has been of the photograph, that is the punctum of time, the prick of the past occupying the present of the photographic image, and even the return of the dead in images of people that have passed away, or the confrontation with our own death surfacing from its point of repression. That is, when the film is viewed in motion, the actors appear alive, but when the film stops, we see them revealed in an inert state, a suspended state. And in this sort of fleeting moment of the past brings forth that which should have remained hidden, the sort of the hidden death, if you like, as Mulvey refers to it, a return of the dead, the uncanny, through this sort of Barthian that has been. But for animation, these objects, drawings, etc., have never had life, and therefore, once the film stops, the objects merely return to their sort of natural inert state, and so the punctum is altered and even reversed. Jenkins describes this in his paper, Another Punctum, Animation, Affect and Ideology, as a punctum of animation that is the never has been. Indeed, animation needs the mechanism of film to bring it into life. It is an illusion, but this illusion reveals something else. Culturally, we understand the trick that brings animation to life. And as Windsor describes in his thesis, What is the Uncanny? The magic trick is not experienced as uncanny as it fails to threaten the subject's grasp on reality. So what is it about animation that is drawing us to the uncanny? I'll try and answer that question a little bit later, and certainly I'm going to be talking about that in other papers. But within today's talk, I want to continue to look at this idea of the that has been and the never has been, and how its relationship works in regard to animated taxidermy. For me, animated taxidermy is endlessly fascinating as it smashes together this that has been of the photograph or live action film and the never has been sort of magic of animation, and is almost a metaphor for the human machine boundary itself. As we know, Morey places taxidermy on the uncanny scale, his uncanny valley, as something that shakes our intellectual certainty. And certainly some pieces of taxidermy look so real and even still animated that they lead us to question as to whether or not indeed they are still animate. For example, we often see them ready, posed to take action, or even mid-action, such as catching prey. And in more modern examples, we even see them running across splashing water. There is, of course, the more tongue-in-cheek varieties, such as the works of Walter Potter, and that is part of the inspiration for the title of the film. But these objects have lost the agency they once possessed in life, but like the photograph, these objects have a that has been, as they were once alive, and so they speak to an existence outside their now inert state. So when taxidermy is reanimated in the works of films such as Jan Schwankmajer that Derrin showed us earlier, in particular in Alice, what does that mean for the never has been punctum of animation? Let's start with the knowing of the trick. So animation does not readily evoke uncanny feelings in us, as already mentioned. We understand the trick. Culturally, we understand that the objects, be them drawings or puppets or stones, are animated through the trick of film, and we are aware of this, and so they do not bring us to a point of intellectual uncertainty. And we find ourselves immersed in the characters' lives, the affective transference, as effective as in other film genres. Of course, these transferences can all be deconstructed psychoanalytically, but we won't get off track today. So the punctum is unusual in these taxidermy objects because they have been, but now they have been transformed into puppets, an object associated with a natural state of inanimacy, brought only to life through the external mechanism. They retain the that has been, but also in some way have an element of magic of the never has been. That is, we understand that they only come to life through the trick of film, but through this process, they have lost their agency. They are now animal-made puppet. This obviously speaks to man's desire to master his environment and his desire to lord over nature, but as they lose their agency through their death and then the subsequent transformation into puppet, do they retain their that has been? And I would say yes. Although through the taxidermy process, all that remains is on most occasions the animal skin and attached fur and feathers, depending on the animal, of course. And sometimes some bones, sometimes the skull, for example, again, depending on what animal you're using. Essentially, all the internal elements of the animal are replaced by a mannequin, and indeed the quality of this mannequin greatly affects the successful outcome of the final object. But the reference of the past life is imbued in the animal's remains through its own material, and therefore that has been remains intact. But the animal has lost its agency and become an automaton moving only at the will of the animator. So we see on screen that has been puppet, now so reliant on the trick of animation to return it into life. Through this interweaving, we could argue that this brings to the surface not only moral questions about the use of animals in modern life, but also it reflects our own desire to investigate what it is perhaps to be a bird compared to a human. And for those of you that might have read Thomas Nagel's What It Is Like to Be a Bat, you'll know that this task is, for him, futile. But that has been, and the reanimation of the material of death does draw our focus to the automaton within, due to its animation now being unreliant on its physical processes of the living body. This then leads us to the fear that we too may be no more than a machine ourselves. Indeed, I believe it was Leibniz that once asked the question, if machines can be so like us, are we like machines? The retaining of the surface of the animal, adding the that has been to the never has been, and so the unstable boundary of animal machine, and then the animal machine, and then by extrapolation, the human machine boundary, as Volschkel would describe it, collapses. And for me, this essentially is what animation reveals in regard to the uncanny. It reveals to us an almost existential crisis, that is the fear that we are nothing more than a sophisticated machine, an automaton with no true agency. And this we see reverberating, this we see reverberating through the reanimated taxidermy, the internal alienness that is abound in psychoanalysis and seen as being at the core of human experience. The boundary of me as matter, the external, and me as phenomena, the internal. The haunting of ourselves by our own unconscious and elusive hidden part of ourselves that we can only glimpse through dreams or associations, but to what images speak. The internal alienness, a perpetual absence that is uncanny, and lies at our core brought into focus. Animation brings to the surface this crisis of our own uncanniness through its puppets and drawings, and that we saw in the automaton of old. And to throw in a quote from Volschkel on automaton and the Enlightenment, the automata's mechanical replication of this experience, that is the mimicking of the sentimental practice of music playing at the time, makes the human-machine boundary unstable. It is unstable because the performance of the automata in this case raises the question, is the automaton experiencing its own subject forming? We can certainly feel the portrayed emotions and a sense of a form of subject on screen in regards to animation. And we experience real empathy through the affective transference as we would interfacing with other human beings. And it is this illusion of life, the convincing nature of the cartoon, that makes us question our own agency and reveals to us the uncanny of ourselves and our own hidden automaton. Cool, thank you. Was that 15 minutes? That was a bit quick.
Thank you so much, Katherine.
Let me just stop sharing my screen 1 second. Apologies, there we go.
Thank you. I just want to ask our speakers if you have any questions for each other first. Katherine, Derrin, and Vincenzo.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I wrote a couple of things out. I love those. Really both really interesting. And I think I had a couple of questions for both of you, actually. One of them was kind of similar in that I just wonder if, so the film, the Potter's Mirror film, is that something you're actually making yourself?
Yeah, so we're working on it at the moment. We've got stuck at the end of pre-production because of COVID. Yeah. So we are sort of, at some point when I can get to the facilities, we'll be making the puppets. So we're at that stage. We're just about to launch into production. We're going to be doing the 2D pixelation sequences over the summer, but yeah, we're going to make I'm going to direct it, and I've written it, and then we'll do some animation and stuff. And
the taxidermy objects, are they static, or are they the kind that like spring to life, like those birds that they put clockwork into? Do you know those kind of? I'm gonna make them. So I do taxidermy. That is one of the many random skills that I have. So I'm going to essentially create puppets
from the skin of the taxidermy. And that's one of the things that we're going to do. So they're going to be animated like a puppet, much like the bird that you showed in Schwankmeyer's Alice there, but it'll be the full bird rather than the bird with the skull on. So it'll be in that, very much in that vein.
Okay. The other thing I was just going to say is I just wondered if you'd seen those, those insect films that.
Oh yeah, Ladovich.
Which
Savage.
Yeah.
I can never pronounce his name. I'm really sorry.
I absolutely love those, and I just wondered if they would probably fit into your thesis somewhere. I would guess if you were doing.
Yeah, I imagine so. I haven't quite pinned down the case studies that I'll do to contextualize what I'm going to write, of course, because I'm still quite early on. But those sprung to mind. Also, obviously, Schwankmeyer and the Brothers Key, obviously. But I need to think about that a little bit more. There were a few other examples. Like Tessa Farmer, she makes little animations with her taxidermy, so I was certainly going to look at those because I think they haven't been examined through the lens of animation as such, whereas the Brothers Key and Schwankmeyer, of course, those are talked about quite a lot, but we're looking at those sorts of things.
That's cool. I did want to ask Vincenzo as well. I wanted to ask do you actually make puppets yourself? Because you talk from a design perspective. I just wondered if you make your own.
Yeah, actually, thanks for asking, because in the first place, I'm a puppet maker. Then I decided to make research about stop motion. So yes, actually, I'm not doing puppet right now, not just because of the COVID, but because after my PhD, somehow I've been, eaten by the university, and so far I'm not having time concretely to making puppet. But yes, I'm a puppet maker, and this research was also to try to experiment with the starting point, actually, to try new experiments and to try to use some materials with a specific aim. Like, okay, I'm using clay because I want to say something. I'm using some other material. I'm casting silicone because I want to demonstrate that I can say not just the narrative, but also another level of meaning. And so that's the idea. I'm working on it, at least I'm trying. And okay, and may I, for a cat, probably I'm mispronouncing it.
No,
that's right, I think.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I have problem with connection. I think your presentation was very interesting, and I can't wait to watch the film. But also I wanted to, probably it's useless, but it's a suggestion, because I understand you are working on your references right now too. So probably you can find interesting the work of Stefano Bessoni. He's an Italian, as well as a researcher, he's a writer and a puppet maker. And actually, Stefano Bessoni, I can text it if you want. So.
Oh yes, yeah. Please, that would be really helpful. Yeah.
Also, because he really his films are, and also his picture books. Many of them speak about the uncanny. So the idea of there are a lot of stories about homunculi. So the idea of the creatures between life and not life. So probably you can find it interesting.
Cool.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I just thought, Vincenzo, that you being someone who makes puppets yourself kind of adds another layer to what you were talking about with things like when the animator looks into the eyes of the puppet that he's making. I mean, that adds another sort of extra personal layer, because actually you do that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I just said 20 minutes, so I couldn't explain all of this, but actually a very big part of my research was about the relationship between a puppet and puppet maker. So also the case studies, because yeah, my presentation probably was very confusing, but the main reason, because I selected self-reflexive narratives, was exactly about that, because I know something that is showing the process. So a narrative that shows the process. And yeah, probably that's the first reason why I decided to conduct this kind of research. Me being a puppet maker more than a researcher.
Excellent. Sorry, I missed your basically most of your presentation, Vincenzo, because my internet completely bombed at totally the wrong time, and then I couldn't get back online. I'm so sorry, but that sounds really interesting. This idea of the relationship between the puppet and the puppet maker, and something else that interests me about the uncanny is this idea that the animator and the puppet have this sort of almost symbiotic relationship, and they're like a doppelganger of each other, like a double. So we're like playing out something of ourselves within the puppet, much like an actor does, obviously, with their own performance, but we do it externally, which makes it even more interesting. But yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to check it out. And I was wondering, I don't have any questions as such, Derrin. I wondered if you'd seen, there's a children's TV series. If you've not got children under the age of 6, you will not have seen it. But there's this brilliant series, having read your thesis and listened to your presentation, called Moon and Me by Andrew Davenport, who does Teletubbies and In the Night Garden. But you should watch it. I wrote a paper about it a while ago because I became obsessed with it, because it reveals for me this hidden inertia that you talk about in your thesis. It brings it to the surface. So what it does is there's a stop motion puppet and some marionette puppets, and the marionettes have had their strings removed, so they sort of move around in this very odd sort of rolling way. The mechanics are all wrong because they're moving from like the outside in, if you like, rather than the inside out, like you would do with a puppet. So that feels a bit odd. So you're already primed for things to be uncanny, but then the stop motion puppet appears and he's in a separate space to start with, but then they come together. And what it does, it reveals and brings to the surface this inertia in quite a visible way. I think you would find that particular series really interesting in your research. And I obsessively write about it all the time, because I'm so obsessed with the colliding of these two techniques that I think for me and you sort of bring out this uncanny nature of the uncanny in particularly in stop motion animation.
And I think I know that in Vincenzo's talk he referred to interdisciplinary techniques, and I think that is quite interesting when stop motion meets other techniques, and it kind of shows itself up more there. You know what I mean? Which is why I include quite a few sort of live action stop motion mix clips, because I think that tends to reveal the joins even more. You know what I mean? It kind of draws attention to it then. Yeah,
they like amplify each other, don't they, in a way. And but I find that less so in 2D when you mix that with live action. I don't know why that is. I've never really explored that, but certainly when you start to put other 3-dimensional objects in with live action, it does have this real sort of strange, odd feeling to it that's very synonymous with the uncanny. I love that kind of thing.
Well, I think it's when with the stop motion, it's that, again, what Vincenzo was talking about, that tactility that you get.
Yeah, exactly.
They feel like you could touch them, you could reach out and touch them, the fur looks real, or the bones are real bones, and all of that sort of thing. I think that just makes it sharper to you. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. No, absolutely. It is something in the fact that it is. I think Vincenzo was talking about being very careful about the materials that he chose in his puppets, and obviously as filmmakers, we're all super obsessed with every material that we put in. You know, nothing is there by accident, and yeah, and that brings this sort of extra layer of tactility to everything, as you say.
Because that's interesting. So do you both, because this is for you, Kath, as well, do you think about these questions when you're making those you know, objects and things that you're going to animate? Are you thinking about that?
Absolutely, 100%. I spend hours thinking about and analysing every single individual material and every object that's going to be on set. Nothing is there by accident, absolutely nothing. You know, like for example, there's a bit in the film, he lives inside a wardrobe, don't ask, and you know, why not, but he has all these objects on the shelves, and I'm currently wrangling, okay, so are they going to be you know, how much reference to organic life do I have? So can I use a stone? Is that too organic, or is that cold enough? You know, so it's all these questions that I spend a long time sort of asking, or do I want them to be reference to man, or do, you know, can I have a shell, or is that too referential to a living object? You know, all these sorts of, yeah, everything, you know, you know, from what type of wax I'm going to use to, you know, what type of every sort of detail. I don't know if Vincenzo goes quite that obsessively about it, but I certainly do.
That's cool.
Hey, Kath, besides storage, your presentation rings a bell of other keywords. For me, technophobia. I don't know if you went for that or not yet. And another thing was that, have you seen those pictures of dead people? I think that there was a ritual many years ago that people, when they passed away, their families, you know, somehow do some makeups on their face and take some photographs. I just wonder
Yes.
if you, yeah.
Like the death mask.
It just reminds me of, those you know, very strange photographs.
Yeah, and again, it sort of, perhaps they bring into question this side, you know, like where it sort of amplifies this sort of punctum of death, if you like, this sort of prick of death that photographic images can certainly have, that Barth talks about in his writings on photographs, and that sort of that haunting. And for me, it leads me back to not only this internal anxiety, this acknowledgement that, you know, we all know that we're all finite in this world, but also this slight fear, certainly in this post-Enlightenment, very scientific, rationalist society and ideology that we live in, that you know, is there more to me, you know, or am I just purely a set of neurological firings? You know, how reductionist am I going to go in that direction, you know, or am I going to be, you know, a bit more non-reductionist? And it's very difficult to articulate, and I think that's what animation brings to the picture for me, is because it's very difficult to articulate that idea that I know that I am more than just some random firings in my brain. I know, I feel that, and I feel that to be true, but I'm unable to articulate it because language somehow fails me, because it can't speak to that phenomenal sort of phenomenological kind of unconscious experience of myself as from inside, as opposed to from outside. Is it Spinoza that talks about that? I can't remember who talks about, I know myself in two ways. I know myself as matter, and I know myself as feeling. So I can control my body in two ways. So, you know, I can move, when I move my fingers, I can see them moving, but there's also something else going on that I can't feel or sense that's coming from inside. And it's that sort of boundary that is of real interest for me at the moment.
Yeah. It's something
And
I
I
tried
think
to cover a little bit in that when I talked about the way that stop motion. I mean, when you animate, and I'm talking to animators here, I realize that, but when you animate, you're conscious of each, you know, individual movement. But as people, we're not really conscious of each individual movement. We just move, like I'm moving my hands and I'm just gesticulating now. I'm not conscious of that. It's almost like I'm just doing it without even thinking about it. And there's a disjuncture there that does bring the uncanny to the surface, I think.
Absolutely, and because this sort of disjuncture coincides with a period of enlightenment and this more atheistic, rationalistic outlook on life, and the death of superstition, it comes back to Freud talking about primitive beliefs that were once surmounted. And so again, it brings us back to the uncanny. And I find that endlessly fascinating. And yeah, you know, I read your thesis, obviously, and you talk about this collapsing of boundaries. And for me, that's, I think, is the boundary for me that's collapsing. In that same way, yeah, you know, we can give this illusion in animated cartoons. And I don't know why it feels more visceral in stop motion, but there is something about it as a medium that brings it much more to the surface, not only through the process, as you say, of the actually, you know, moving it incrementally, and making you aware that there's all this other stuff behind it that we, you know, that's unknown, familiar yet unfamiliar.
Yeah.
Another question I have for you, Kath and Derrin, is about Starwich and his wax puppets. I wonder if the sense of uncanny is obvious in his animations or not.
I think it is. I think
how about in comparison with Schwankmeyer?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's kind of an extra layer with people like Méliès and Starowich, and anyone who you're looking back on films that were made at a certain time. I think you get a kind of you have to take into account that things move slightly oddly in older films anyway. Do you know what I mean? So you have to add that on the top. But I would say so, definitely. I mean, the first time I saw one of Starowich's films, I think I loved it, but it is so very strange in the context of, I mean, you know, modern day.
Such an odd thing to do, isn't it? But of course, he started because he was an entomologist, wasn't he, originally? And he couldn't get the film, The Mating Ritual of the Stag Beetle or something, I seem to remember reading somewhere. And so, yeah, but then it's such a leap then to then put little coats on them and do all these weird things with them. But yeah, I mean, for me, you know, animation does have all these surface tropes, like, you know, the sort of the inanimate made animate and all of that sort of thing, which sort of primes us for the uncanny. But I think for me, it doesn't make it uncanny because we know the trick. We understand the magic trick, and so an illusion, a magic, you know, a magic trick isn't experienced as uncanny because, as Mark Windsor says, it doesn't disrupt our grasp on reality. The uncanny is something that sort of really disturbs us at a much deeper level and really threatens our certainty, our intellectual certainty, as Jens.
Do you think the story is influential in this respect?
Yeah, I mean, the mise en scène and things like that in like Schwankmeyer and the Brothers Key prime us absolutely for the uncanny. You know, the narrative, the feelings that are evoked in it are certainly
the layers
very
of meaning that Schwankmeyer tries to add to his animations. You know, somehow reinforce the sense of uncanny in his animations. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's a brilliant medium in which to explore the ideas, you know, because it is so readily, you know, it's there, it's ready, primed to go, isn't it, for the uncanny? As a vehicle, it's a fabulous medium, in my opinion.
I know that we are running out of time, but I have another question for Vincenzo. I just wanted to have your opinion on that regarding the 3D printing in stop motion animation, and you mentioned that the tactility of materials of the puppets. I just wanted to know that, okay, then what happens to that tactility when it turns to, you know, 3D digital printing?
Okay, well, it's not easy to answer this question because you can answer in very different ways. In the analysis they conducted, the 3D printed process was considered under the category of cast material. So the meta-narratives that I linked with the process was the one about the attempt to find the perfection in characterizing the shape of something. So that's what by using 3D printing process, probably a puppet maker tried to achieve. But my personal interpretation is that it is completely wrong, of course. Not because I disagree with the process, of course not. Actually, I'm working right now on a process, and I want to buy a 3D printer because I want to do experiments with this process, trying to print faces, replacement faces. But for the fact that even in those cases, how can I say, the particularity of the technique is the I will say probably wrong detail, but it's not wrong because it looks wrong, but because it has to be in that way. So that in my reasoning actually in the thesis ends exactly like that. The way in which I somehow criticize the use of digital frame to change, to adjust, to fix things, yeah. Because as you can understand, the process of puppet making or the process of manipulation of puppet during the animation made something, the things not perfectly, not perfect at all in any sense. And so yes, I lost the first sentence, but my interpretation, my point of view is exactly that. The fact that even if it's okay, it's a very good way to use new techniques of puppet making, and also probably new digital tools in the process of animation itself. It's necessary to take care of the essence of stop motion animation, that is making things also looking real. And in order to do that, well, actually, I don't want to open it, and I should be staged in a stop motion film, according to me, of course. But I think the important things in the work of stop motion animator and puppet maker is exactly to take care of the reality of the object that they are working with. So even if you use another kind of process, I mean, I hope tomorrow someone else will invent another technique to fabricate puppets. It can happen, I mean, in 2000. So I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, sure. That was perfect. I can continue this discussion with you about perfection, but I just ask Simon to wrap this session up. And thank you so much, Vincenzo, Kath, and Derrin, for your presentations. That was really brilliant, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation to present in this session. Over to you, Simon.
I don't think I need to do anything to wrap up. Farzaneh, you've done it perfectly yourself, as I knew you would. But I'm very happy to, to host and use my Zoom account for these occasions. That was really great, Katherine, Derrin, and Vincenzo. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations and listening to the questions that you had for each other. It seems to me it's a valuable platform, and I think it's a great idea, Farzaneh. You should keep going with that in mind. put your feelers out to see who else you can get together for the subsequent seminar, and let's make it a continuing series. So thank you very much, Farzaneh. Thank you very much for the presenters to share your work with everyone, and that's great. Yes, thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you so much, Simon, for all your support. And I know that you have so many insights to put in this discussion.
I have some, well, I had questions, but I thought there's too many more important questions happening amongst the presenters. So I'll save them for another day. So we have recorded this, haven't we, Farzaneh? I'm going to send the video file to you, and at some point you'll share it with the other presenters and possibly make it available more widely, but we can discuss that later. Anyway, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Have a good evening. Bye.
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 Bye.